And we should be doing everything we can to warn about what's going to happen with that massive mega technology, which apparently already last year, data centers used more drinking water than the whole global human population. So we're talking about massively increasing these data centers. For what? It's mainly for the war machine. Now, there are people who know the technology better than I do who say it could be used in a positive way, but not in the hands of that empire.
Välkommen tillbaka till Samtal vi saknar. Jag heter Gustaf Skarsgård.
Jag heter Frida Stranne.
Idag ska vi träffa en väldigt spännande gäst som heter Helena Norberg-Hodge. Hon är på besök i Sverige idag, men hon har bott utomlands i 60 år, bland annat i Ladakh i Indien, och skrivit böcker om ursprungsbefolkningen där. Hennes primära fokus är en kritik mot det globala ekonomiska systemet och handelsavtal. Hon driver rörelsen Local Futures och hon har också skapat en kampanj som jag är del av mot ISDS-klausuler i internationella handelsavtal.
Som jag inte har förstått riktigt vad det är, så det blir väldigt spännande.
Ja. Så lyssna på vårt samtal med henne. Bitar kommer att vara på engelska, för det är hennes första språk numera. Om ni har svårt med det så kan man också titta på YouTube, och där finns det textat. And if you're an English speaker, parts of this conversation will be in English, and whatever is not will also be subtitled in English on YouTube. Stay tuned. Ja, men då kör vi igång. Helena Norberg-Hodge, välkommen till Samtal vi saknar.
Tack så mycket.
Det är väldigt fint. Vi sitter nu i ett rum här hemma hos Sebastian Baudet. Och det var i den där soffan där borta som jag och Frida satt när vi spelade in vårt första pilotavsnitt och pratade med dig över Zoom när du var i Byron Bay.
Ja.
Och nu sitter vi här tillsammans alla tre ett halvår senare. Det känns väldigt fint, så varmt välkommen.
Ja. Tack så jättemycket.
Det här är ju då en samtalsserie som går ut på diskrepansen som jag och Frida känner mellan vad vi upplever som de egentliga hoten som vi står inför som mänsklighet och avsaknaden av de perspektiven i det publika samtalet. Ja. Och då bjuder vi in gäster som vi vill lyssna på och höra vilka samtal de saknar. Det går bra att prata både engelska och svenska, vilket du känner dig mest bekväm med, för vi kommer texta på svenska. I'll also say this in English. You can speak English if you like, and then there will be Swedish subtitles on YouTube. And both languages will be subtitled.
Ja. Jag vill gärna visa att jag är svensk, och jag kommer att tala lite svenska, men det blir lättare på engelska när för det mesta.
Så vi börjar helt enkelt som vi alltid gör med frågeställningen till gästen. Vilka är de samtalen som du saknar i den publika debatten?
Ja, alltså de samtalen, det är rätt många. Det gäller nästan allting. Alltså vad jag har upplevt med många resor och kontakter på hela jorden egentligen. Det är att vi får inte höra om det allra viktigaste. Både orsaker av vår kris, vår polycrisis, men också att det finns så många underbara människor som har skapat systemiska lösningar. Så nu tar jag det nog på engelska. There's a whole movement underway of people, and I see it in every country, realizing that we need to move towards nature. And that also means connect more with one another. So it's a community building, and it's a connection to nature, to the plants, to the animals, to the water. And there's a deep longing among people to do that. But at the same time, there is a system that we haven't paid attention to, a global economic system that our governments are supporting. And unfortunately, that global economic system controls the media and even what's happening in science. So almost every avenue of getting knowledge has become corrupted by big money. And it's really difficult to push out through the mainstream media to actually get an honest look at why we are facing so many crises and that people clearly don't want this system. We don't get to hear about that. So, that includes everything from the truth that we could produce more food while healing nature. We're being subjected to myths that say there are too many people to go back to the land and we need more and more technology to feed ourselves. That's probably one of the most important myths, but there are many others. Better not go on for too much longer because I could, talk for an hour about that.
But that's why we're here.
Yeah, that's why we're here.
We're
Just
lending you the
continue.
mic for you to go on.
Well, I suppose when I try to look at the most important myths, then what's happening to food and the many myths that the people who promote them often believe them because they've been gradually educated into this belief that modern agriculture was more efficient and we produced more food, which we never did. The truth is that we were able to produce food with fewer people, and that farmers everywhere were pushed to become bigger and bigger and do monoculture for export. And that actually meant that they were destroying the land and that they became not only less productive, but often so destroyed the land that it can't even produce. Whereas at the grassroots level, people are coming back to those destroyed, dead lands, and by using real wisdom and learning from the past and supporting diversification, building up the soil, which needs quite a lot of people. So a lot of these local food systems around the world that focus on diversity are also little farms where quite a lot of people work together. And that also makes it more enjoyable. So that's, again, I could go on and on about just food, but I want to say that the other most important, perhaps, myth is that we are going from crisis to crisis because of some human innate need to keep growing. It's just rubbish. No one who's 6 foot tall wants to become 7 foot tall or 8 foot tall. It's just not at all inbuilt into the human psyche to want to keep growing and growing. And I also witnessed that in cultures where the wealth creation was directly from nature, so you were actually talking about fields and animals and building materials, no one would ever want to just keep growing and growing. You can only look after so much land. You can only look after so many animals. So there's a natural limit. And of course, the other part of that was that people lived more connected in community. And so there was naturally there were very strong social pressures too, not to hoard and become more and more selfish. But so really important is that we liberate ourselves from this terrible, heavy message that we don't care. We keep driving our cars, we keep wanting to go on holiday in an airplane, and we don't care about climate change. So we're basically all going to go over the edge. The truth is that we've ended up allowing the creation of an economic system where the main contributors to climate change have been the giant global corporations that exactly at the point that Al Gore started talking about climate change, those big businesses were moving to poor countries to produce. So they were going off to Mexico and Indonesia, India, and massively increasing their emissions, both by producing on the other side of the world and then shipping things, not just back to industrialized countries, but also shipping things back and forth. We have a massive increase in emissions because of globalization, which gave global corporations more power. We need to look at that and not demonize the people in the corporations and not demonize ourselves either, but just have a clear and calm look at the truth of what's going on, which, as you started saying, we're not really getting those conversations in the media. So I'm really glad to be able to talk to you too today about some of the many, many things that we don't get to hear. I feel I need to pause and let you speak.
No, not at all. I'm curious to hear more about your definition of the problem, this global corporate empire that you describe. How does it function? How is it enforced? What is it? What is that truth that most people might not be aware of or hear enough about?
Yeah. Well, I'm often advised by my husband not to go all the way back to the origins, but I feel that it lends more clarity. So I think we really need to understand that the roots of our economy started sort of in the 1400s, when from Europe, the leaders, the kings, sent off traders, basically to rob other people of their resources, in the beginning gold and silver and spices and so on. They worked also with Christian missionaries who went around the world convinced that their religion was the best, and they essentially made indigenous, more traditional people feel that they were inferior, and simultaneously there was this beginning of a Western-based system robbing people of their resources. That in Europe later on was also linked to enclosures, which meant that the elites pushed people off the land, literally changed regulations and laws to destroy the commons and push people into cities. And this is at the same time that traders were involved in the slave trade. And among other things, with the slave trade, they were pushing people away from producing a range of things for themselves to produce for the traders. So that meant people were forced to stand, on cotton fields all day, or sugar cane, or mining, coffee, tea. So suddenly, the whole world, as we grew up, we used to learn about different countries as being, oh, that's a tin country, or that's a tea region, that's coffee. We didn't realize that we were actually talking about defining the whole world according to very brutal exploitation and destruction. But this system, it built up. So, from my point of view, because what was set in motion was an extremely greedy, resource-hungry economy where traders were actually coming in, primarily from Europe, but also collaborating with elites in other countries. And now what was set in motion was this desire for more and more, and a type of growth that knew no limits. So as far as I'm concerned, the world wars were very much connected to this resource-hungry, exploitative, expansive economy. But then, after the Second World War, there were a lot of well-intentioned people who became convinced that what we need to avoid another war and to avoid another depression is to ensure that all economic activities integrated. We're all part of the same interlinked economy. So it's now marketed as something that would be really beneficial for other countries. And what was set up was the World Bank, the IMF, International Monetary Fund, and very importantly, the GATT. And the GATT was the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And that general agreement was that now countries were going to be pushed to open their doors to global corporations. And we know that when leaders try to protect their economies, we got to hear about protectionism as this very nasty thing, and we also know that many leaders were actually killed or disappeared or were attacked in various ways when they tried to go against this dictate. So we had really, by now it was mainly America as the driving force, and American intelligence and the CIA involved in all of this. And I could also deviate to let you know that I myself was accused of being a CIA agent because the CIA would train people in something called the Summer Institute of Linguistics. and send them out as missionaries to different countries, and they really liked to send them to countries that were not going along with this free trade agenda, and they would have these people learn the local languages, particularly of border tribes, to then create uprisings to destabilize these governments. And here I am in 1975 going to a very sensitive border zone in India, and it's called Ladakh or Little Tibet. And then, as the newspaper reported, here I am, this mysterious German woman, because I came out with a German film team and I speak fluent German. And in the newspaper they were saying, how can you allow this mysterious German woman who picked up the language suspiciously quickly stay in Ladakh? This is crazy. So there was always this suspicion. And in a way, I would have been a perfect candidate. So it was very difficult for many years, to feel terrible about not ever being able to prove that you're not a spy. It used to be a horrible weight on me. Anyway, to come back to the bigger story, after the Second World War, this pressure to open up these doors with this global framing, this General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, IMF, World Bank, all working to spread these global, primarily American, but not only, corporations, to go into other countries. And later on, in the late 1980s, there was a renewed pressure from global banks and corporations to push this agenda even further and harder. There had been some signs that people were rethinking the economy, particularly the environmental movement in the West from the 60s and 70s. And now here comes this big push to persuade environmentalists and other people questioning this growth economy that here now we're going to go out and we're going to make these poor people just as rich as us. So globalization was introduced, with this big, big push. And we have to understand that the trade aspect was one of the most important and overlooked. So many people on the left would critically look at the World Bank and the IMF, but not talk about the trade agenda. So that's why it's the single most important point for us to understand why we're hurtling from one crisis to another. We've allowed giant corporations to invade the world, to use more and more energy, more and more resources, and all the time replacing people. And maybe, now, we should talk about the ISDS clauses, which we want to get, particularly want people to focus on that because it is so outrageous. And I feel like maybe you should talk about that.
But can I just add something to all this that you're describing, because you describe it so well. But I just want to add that this open door policy from the United States to open up markets and make the leadership in different countries to be open for Americans, that has actually motivated more than 4,000 military operations from the CIA. So we talk about a large amount of interventions, military interventions in different countries with millions of deaths as a consequence of this. So I just wanted to add that.
Well, thank you. Very good to hear those numbers, which I didn't know about. And are you saying in this period from...
actually from 47 when the CIA was funded and onward. So, but especially during the 60s and 70s, we have lots of examples where this open door policy was the motivation for these actions. And assassinations of leaders that did not want to open up. Everyone was, more or less, every one of these interventions was also motivated as go to what you say, mota the communism.
Yes.
But it was never, not never, but it was often not about communists. It was this open door, and the young countries that had been colonized before, they wanted to be independent. They wanted not to be part of the Soviet Union or the US. They wanted to grow in their own way, but they were not allowed to because CIA intervened.
Yeah. And of course.
No, I just wondered if you wanted me to discuss the ISDS.
I think that would be really good.
Well, the first time I even heard about ISDS was during our first conversation. We were sitting in that couch and had the Zoom conversation, and you asked us, "Do you know what ISDS is?" And I had no idea. And you told me about this investor-state settlement.
Investor-state dispute settlement.
Clauses in the trade agreements. And I was baffled because I'd never heard about it before. But what it actually is, as I've understood it, is a means for corporations to sue governments if they were to adopt policies and laws that would harm or hurt their not only profit but even potential future profit, which is basically backbinding democracy, right? And I think it's such a poignant point, like a acupressure point to push at, to put pressure on, because it might sound dry, but it's just like a perfect example of how these mechanics work. So that's why you started this campaign, the Real Economy, that wants to shed the light on, which I'm part of, to shed the light on this ISDS clauses.
Yeah, I'm so grateful for your participation because, as we were saying, it's so hard to get anything out. It's and it's so unfortunate that there's such resistance, because my experience is that even at the top, in the both political and economic hierarchies, people are really not aware of what this is adding up to. They are not being forced to step back and really look at the connections between this type of growth and massive social and environmental destruction. So I think it's up to us to keep trying to have these conversations that normally don't get out, and to do it with kindness, to do it with an understanding that there's a lot of blindness, not always maybe, but I've found that greed or values are not really the issue, because I've worked a lot with small businesses and farmers to try to set up local systems, which are so amazing because they can solve so many problems, that very often the small farmers or the small business owners are a bit reluctant, and they can often be quite greedy in the sense they're struggling to just stay alive. They're struggling to keep their shop open or to keep farming. So the issue isn't greed. The issue really is that very few people have stepped back to really look at this system and to highlight what we really must recognize as a root cause of multiple crises. And we just can't afford anymore to keep treating symptoms and individual problems. I shouldn't say we can't afford. I would urge anyone listening to, of course, perhaps keep focus on whether they're focusing on the bees or the whales or poverty or injustice, peace, women's rights, but also address the root cause of their particular issue. So we'll have a joint, a connected voice that demands of our government that they no longer abandon us, the voter, in favor of obeying the orders from global corporations that we don't even know the names of. We don't even know who they are. So, the truth is that this blindness and this adherence to growing the economy through more trade, that we need to recognize is one of the main problems. And Frida,
jag skulle bara vilja backa bandet lite, för att ni pratar om någonting som ni båda känner till ganska väl.
Ja.
Men för oss som inte vet nästan något om detta, så skulle jag bara vilja backa bandet. Dels skulle jag vilja fråga dig, för att du slutade din historia om den ekonomiska utvecklingen någon gång på 90-talet med globaliseringen som fördjupades. Men hur utvecklingen blev efter det till detta, och sen lite tydligare förklara vad är det här ISDS och när implementerades det?
Ja.
Är ni med? Did you understand my question?
Ja. Så att jag började tala om hur efter världskriget så hade man den här starka big push for telling everyone we need to integrate everybody. And then, probably because of the rise of the environmental movement, there was a real push again in the 80s by big business, and they came up with the name globalization. And this again they wanted to renew the GATT. They called it the Uruguay round of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and they wanted to push this through, getting governments to agree to open up their doors. And at that time, I took the initiative to something called the International Forum on Globalization. And I was able to persuade two big funders. One of them was Doug Tompkins, who was an amazing man because he loved nature passionately. He had started North Face, the clothing company. He was a sports person. And then he started another big multinational called Esprit, which became a big clothing company. So he'd made many hundreds of millions from this, but he was just seeing the destruction as so terrible that he decided to sell the whole business and just devote the rest of his life to saving nature. And I met him right at that point and was able to persuade him to look at the root cause of the nature destruction, this globalizing trade agenda. And then also was able to persuade the brother of a close colleague of mine, who was Teddy Goldsmith. And he had started the Ecologist magazine in England. And when he went to university at Oxford, he ended up going out with a friend to Africa. The friend was very interested in wildlife, but Teddy said, as an Englishman, also half French, that when he was sitting around the fire with some indigenous people, he started crying and realizing, this is how we should live. So he developed this fascination for indigenous people. So, of course, when I met him in the 70s, we became soulmates. And his brother, his younger brother, had said when he was like 8, I want to be the richest man in the world. And he was a very tough guy. And he had started doing this sort of global takeovers and become very wealthy. And for a long time, they couldn't really even speak to each other. But we were able to influence this rich brother. And so first about nuclear power, and he owned L'Express in France. They were, they're half French. And he started publishing articles about the dangers of nuclear power. And I think that helped him realize the resistance to looking honestly at things. So he became a little more willing to listen to us. And then he read my book, Ancient Futures. And then he went to Bhutan. And then he called us up and he said, you're right, we're going in the wrong direction. He saw there was no poverty there. So that made him open to help fund this Forum on Globalization. And you can still see him on YouTube debating with Bill Clinton's chief economic advisor. And it's a very good thing to look at because, here he is saying, as a he was at that point probably the richest man in the world. He was always saying, people don't want to actually say the really rich one, but he was one of the richest, friendly with Reagan, Thatcher, Kissinger. And he starts putting articles in the New York Times, the London Times, says, I don't want to be a rich man on a dead planet, and I don't want to be a rich man on a planet where everybody else is poor. And so when he's talking to Clinton's chief economic advisor, her name was Laura Tyson at that time, I had also been able to meet her in the White House. But his conversation is so much more important and recorded on YouTube on, what's his name? Anyway, he's there saying, what you're doing now with this trade agenda is you're going to create much more poverty in America. You know, you're forcing businesses like me to go to where labor is cheaper. And we're not improving conditions there either, over there. So he was saying, no. Anyway, so we started this forum on globalization, and we were able, with the funding, to invite about 40 people from around the world to meet regularly and to look at the impact of the trade treaties. And Vandana Shiva was one of them. So I had introduced her to Doug Tompkins, and then also some Malaysian colleagues, someone named Mohammed Idris and Martin Kaur, who had opened my eyes to the trade treaties before that, in the early 80s. And so we actually gained momentum, and we were able to have enough funding to have big conferences, sometimes with 1,000 people or so, and mainly in America, but we also did some in Europe and in Japan. So then in 1999, we had the WTO meeting in Seattle. And this now for us was this horror that now the corporations were setting up this World Trade Organization. When what I was saying is what we need is a WEO, a World Environment Organization. But now we're getting a World Trade Organization. And there was this big battle there. And on my way to Seattle, I was reading in the Economist magazine, and they were saying this is very scary. Every time governments get together, there are demonstrations. We've really got to ratify something in Seattle because, you know, there's a growing tide of resistance. It's just a question of putting together the bigger picture, and I feel that we have a chance. I really do.
It's interesting. I mean, these conversations we've had with different people, right? If there is, and also listening to this conversation, if there's one, you know, red thread going through all of them, it is the impact of corporate interests on politics, right? And how that functions. And we have, you know, the Citizen United Act in a case in America where you allow corporations the human rights basically, and you know, deregulate their influence on politics. And in Sweden we also have that. And to me, it's just so clear that when you're speaking about Obama or even, you know, the governance of Sweden, it's like you have these pseudo opposition, right? That is basically just for show, because it's still in the interest of the corporate of the corporations, and they're still loyal to that system, regardless if you're on the left or the right, with some exceptions who dare to criticize the system. So again, it's like. It's not. I mean, what's the point of governments, right? Is it to protect the interest of the corporations against the people, or the interest of the people and the nature against the corporate interest? It must be the latter, and we've completely missed that. We've missed the core point of a democracy. We've missed the core point of having, you know, governance. If they are allowed to be loyal to corporate interest. Yeah. It's the inverted reason of their existence, and we have to highlight that. And so I think, like, either we have to highlight that and really start safeguarding against those corporate interests in our politics, or we need to create a completely different system, because we have to realize that what we're living in now is a pseudo democracy. Yeah. And I believe in democracy. I really do. And I think that it potentially, with the right guardrails against corporate interests, we might be able to establish a real democracy. Or we will have to, you know, revolutionize this and come up with something completely different. But people need to understand these things. Yeah,
and when you say come up with something completely different, again, then we would have to end this collusion between our supposed representatives who we've elected. They talk to us to get elected. We have to understand that right now, as they go into power, by being wedded to this idea of growth And this idea there's no alternative, they are actually not representing us at all. And so I think we should also look at what I came to realize, which is that governments are these absolutely necessary servants for this corporate empire, because they've been using our taxes, and that means also our labor, and they've been subsidizing global businesses while squeezing everybody else for taxes. They've been using laws and regulations to punish everybody who's within the national arena, and often with very stupid, very inappropriate bureaucratic regulation. And in the meanwhile, the whole free trade thing is about removing regulations from these giants. So here we have a system that is so totally unfair, and yet almost no one is talking about it. And that's what I think, that's what we're trying to change, is that in a country like Sweden, that there'll be enough courageous people, and that there'll be enough of a relationship between people and government, so that there will be the beginnings of a listening and a willingness to look at it honestly. And then again, it's not about demonizing. It's about saying simply that here we are now, we're looking honestly about how this empire has been built up, these corporations and banks that pay no tax and that are subsidized. And remember, the subsidies include building up the infrastructure for them. So it's basically transforming the world with the bigger and bigger energy supplies, which now include renewable energy systems that are a sham, that we don't need. They're in order to encourage redundant trade where we import and export the same thing, because the enemy of that empire is self-reliance. So any country that starts providing for its own needs within its own boundaries, that's the enemy for this cancerous growth. So once we realize our choice, then do we try to create a global government to manage this global empire, or do we just sensibly realize global government would mean that our voices would be even smaller, it'd be one of 8 billion people, or do we decentralize business? It's not a big deal. Why don't we say, sorry, Volvo, Mitsubishi, General Motors, you're not allowed to roam around freely. You're going to come back to your country and you're going to be subjected to rules. You are not going to be ordering our people and our government what to do. We've got some rules, and we want to protect people's health and the environment, and we want people to have meaningful work. We want them to be able to prioritize what to subsidize, what to tax. And this is really, it's these mechanisms that we haven't looked at. What is taxed, what's subsidized, and what's regulated. We haven't realized that our governments on left and right have used those tools to shape our future. And they're shaping our future towards massive pollution, an epidemic of depression, anxiety, addiction, suicide, epidemic worldwide, and particularly among young people. Let's put this out on the table and realize that this global system serves no one except a tiny number of billionaires who want to get richer.
Can I just ask what you think? How do we do that? How do we move in that direction without, at the same time, moving into the trap of nationalism and racism? Because some of what you say is the same as the MAGA movement, Make America Great Again, or America First, maybe. MAGA is a bit different, but Put America First Again. Which I think we should listen to what they have to say as well. We can't. Everyone has to listen more carefully to one another, because there are different driving forces for why we engage in things. And I think that some of this America First or MAGA people have been aware of all this due to the cost of the war. So they actually, at the same time as they have this racism and different kinds of things within its movement, it also has come to the conclusion that this American empire is doing no good. Actually, it has cost so much for the American people, and they have become a kind of peace movement. It's really interesting to follow, and it's something that is very difficult to talk about because everyone thinks that we should just we can't listen to those people because they are crazy or they are whatever. But I think it's very interesting because there is such an awareness in America that also that the empire is naked, and we are hurting ourselves with being so engaged in different wars, costly, never-ending wars, without any gain, because that makes America more insecure. So that's much more awareness of this by the American people that here in Europe, where we continue to look at America as the savior. So my question, that was a little lecture, but my question then, how do we avoid, because when you're talking about this, that protectionism, it's not only bad, how do we do that in an open way?
From my point of view, not difficult at all.
No?
But we need to sort out the distinction between nationalism and an economy that brings us back to the real economy, to the earth, to the water, to the people, and to care for all of that. That is completely different from nationalism. Nationalism has been created from the empire. It was created in this colonial era where artificial boundaries were drawn and that suited the empire. And again, let's remember, it was the wealth creation by global traders. And we have to also distinguish completely between the voters and these demagogue leaders like Trump and Milley and so on. Many of the voters, as you say, are waking up, and they're not in favor of those wars, but Trump certainly is. Yeah. And so we have to really, really be clear that we should distinguish. First of all, we should be distinguishing between the voter and the political leaders. So what's already been happening in most countries is that the party politics, like, say, Labour Party in America or Labour Party in England, and the Conservatives, they're a completely different beast from the voters. We have to really, in a way, distinguish between Conservatives with the big C and the small c, and equally in Labour. So what's happened is that the party politics, just like we're saying, they're going with the creation of the empire. And they're, to some extent, listening a little bit to their voters, but actually what they're promoting, the policies they're promoting, continues the same economic monstrous growth that is so dangerous now for people and the planet. And of course we know it's inseparable. So it's unfortunate that many people on the left, they think that supporting that local economy is going to be based on continuing to exploit other people on the world, around the world, which is Trump's model, extract, but then we're really going to be focusing on just us being great. Localization is actually about us becoming more self-reliant so that others can become more self-reliant. So it is a genuinely egalitarian and ecological approach forward. So I really, really, really hope we can drive that home to the listener. Please don't confuse nationalism with localism. And also be aware, I think if we could go deeper, and we even look at Hannah Arendt and people writing after the war, she started touching on what I'm talking about, but didn't really. She basically said, it's beyond my knowledge. And I think what's true is that very few people have looked at this from a global point of view. And it's when you see it from a global point of view that you realize that people all around the world would benefit from the right to build more community and to build a healthier, truly sustainable economy.
And solidarity as well. Solidarity with the people. That's what I feel like the potency of this perspective, which I believe is the real, a realer perspective anyway, is that it's not about hating America or China or Russia or whoever we've chosen as the latest, antagonist, but rather to be like, no, I'm to build a solidarity which is always on the side of the people and the nature. And that is the core factor in all countries.
Yeah.
And that's why I feel like I've been looking, because I like terminology, and I do believe, I'm, way more socialistic than capitalistic at my core, right? And I do believe in the potency of eco-socialism, but I'm also concerned about creating a system that are too top-down enforced, right?
Yeah.
So now I was playing with the idea, maybe we could have an internationalist, localized eco-socialism.
Yeah, well, I mean, you see, when you say eco-socialism, to me, because socialism ended up growing up with industrialism, which meant with urbanization.
But that's where the eco takes away that aspect from the socialism.
Well, no, it's just that because socialism still, socialism was industrial, I would prefer just to use, well-being of people and planet, or, not use.
But that's also where it comes from, right? Why did the CIA attack any socialist movement? It is to protect the wealthy.
Yeah.
It is to protect the center of the wealth, right?
Yeah.
Against a socialization, meaning for the people, for the best interests of the people. That's what socialism is.
Yeah.
I know we're so afraid of that terminology, and I see it all the time. And it's like, oh, but now it's because it's like it's a hard sell for a lot of people.
Yeah.
But if we actually look at it, and if we look at what eco-socialists today actually propose, it's very aligned to everything that you're talking about.
Well, I'd love to know them, because what I see generally is this urban industrial view. I don't see enough attention to farming. And see, again, when you do pay attention to farming, and when I say farming, I mean fishery and forestry is what I mean, primary production on the land, which has been perverted and promoted in a way that's destroying the land, poisoning us all. And whether we're in Afghanistan or Sweden or, following that formula is deadly for people, and it's deadly for meaningful work. And that's what's missing in the eco-socialist world that I'm saying. That's
where you have the two qualifying words of internationalist, built on the solidarity of always putting people and planet first. So internationalist, localized, which is what you're talking about. Eco-socialism. So they'd all have. You need all three components, right?
Yeah.
Maybe that could be a path
stuck
forward.
in old thinking here, because I'm not a political theorist or a philosopher, but I think we have to reset. We have to find something completely different that we don't know now what it is.
No, this is just a speculation in like what could it be? What that would be aligned with envisioning this kind of future, right? That would be beneficial to humanity as a whole and to the planet.
Yeah. Well, I feel like we have found it. I do, because from having had the experience of being in indigenous culture where there was no poverty and there was, this particular indigenous culture showed so clearly that if we organize ourselves in communities, so intergenerational community is part of it, and what does that mean for education? What does that mean for production? But if we organize ourselves that way, and that means all the time paying attention to others, to human fabric, and to everything that lives, that we're dependent on. We need to do it in a more localized way. It needs to be with more intimate relationships. We become stupid when we sit at the EU, as they have done, and tell farmers when to bring the hay in. In the Alps compared to, Skåne, it's a completely different time. We become stupid when we think we can manage life from a great distance. And so that's also where, the sort of communist and socialist idea of doing things for the people, but from a top-down structure, it doesn't work, because we are all unique. We are all changing all the time. So in localization, we talk about the principle of subsidiarity, that the principle is that do everything at the lowest level possible and only move up when it's necessary. And so I want us to be recognizing that the only thing we produce that every person needs every day, 3 times a day usually, is food. And, in the socialist thinking, in the degrowth movement, and so, from my point of view, they're not relegating that production to the central role that it needs to have. Now, that doesn't mean that in the future that we're going to have to go back to what we did in the indigenous way. In most places, everybody was involved with food, either gathering or production. So that wouldn't be necessary, because we could also employ technologies, and so there'd be some people who would be doing other things. But to reduce it to now, we're going to the point where we're going to not have any farmers. It's about 1% in most industrialized countries. And to think that we're going to replace them with technology, to me, it means we haven't understood how to make, the land thrive. And we have to also take into account that we're 8 billion people. So if we want to shrink the human footprint, which we need to do if we want the water to be clean and if we want to have healthy food, we're going to need more people on the land. And so that's where the slight difference is. From what I'm talking about is a global movement or an international collaboration, absolutely, because we're going to need that to deal with the global empire anyway. But this is completely coming from the concern of allowing us to live in a way that we don't exploit people on the other side of the world that we've never even met. And we're not victims to a giant system where the oppressors, we don't even know their names. It's a crazy, abstract, distant, machine-like system. And we mustn't, through idealism, fall prey to the same mistake. Because what happened in Ladakh, for me, was that it was so clear that in the modern world we had gone too far in this urbanizing industrial direction, and it had gone hand in hand with science, which had encouraged this belief that we can understand life by breaking it down into tinier and tinier bits. And we had these specialists, and already in the 60s, Rachel Carson was warning us, wake up. Science is too reductionist. In the 60s, we think we can poison these insects and we're poisoning ourselves. Let's wake up. So there was a wake up. And we were all pushing. I was part of an environmental movement where we were all pushing for that change. And I taught in some of those universities. And we were clear that we needed to look directly at this growth economy and question it, and that we needed decentralization. We had a very wonderful book from Schumacher called Small is Beautiful, and he had to completely rethink what he had learned as an economist, because he ended up in Burma in the 60s, and basically he saw what I saw. He comes as a trained economist and sees there's no poverty here. And these are among the happiest people I've ever met. He has to rethink economics, including technology, including bringing in a spiritual, holistic view. And then in Ladakh, if I hadn't read his book when I was in Ladakh, I might not have had the courage to speak out and write to the Indian government, because as a woman who sort of loved this place and could see this, if there hadn't been this well-known economist who was saying the same thing, I don't know, maybe I wouldn't have had the courage. I sort of feel I probably wouldn't have. But anyway, that gave me a lot of strength. And then later on, when I wrote my book, Ancient Futures, I had messages from all over the world, more than 40 languages, people saying, you're telling our story too. So from my experience and those voices, I'm not going to shut up. And I will keep questioning you about wanting to use socialism, not at all because I'm afraid of it. Not at all.
Why are you afraid of it?
Because it has always been too centralized. And therefore, why use the same word for something that has always been too industrial, too urban, too centralized, and therefore inefficient, not ecological, and not egalitarian enough?
No, but it could be. I mean, that's the point. I mean, because you're reacting to the word, right?
Yeah.
Socialism. Yeah. But socialism is not eco-socialism. And if you were to have a localized internationalist eco-socialism.
Yeah.
You haven't seen that yet. That's why I'm speculating here, and I'm looking for new ways forward, because I can also see risks if we only do the localization.
Yeah.
First of all, I can see the risk of it being, stolen by other interests, which I don't align with, in terms of nationalism and ethnocentrism, and that it will also could lead to a lack of, I'm from a big city, right? I enjoy multiculturalism. I'm a metropolitan being, and there's a lot of beauty in that. And there's a risk in that too, that you start expecting certain people to belong to certain land, etc. When I'm looking for a more holistic identification as a humanity. So I see a risk in that, and then also within this current system, that there might be just pockets of countries doing this that would not affect the whole. And then the third risk is people from the global south might not want to do this, because the story that we have sold to ourselves and to them is that this is the peak of progress, this is the peak of civilization. I remember when I was in Borneo, when I was in my early 20s, and I was there, and I was visiting a longhouse, the indigenous people in the jungle, and this guide is taking me through the river, and I'm like, this is the most amazing experience I've ever had. And he was like, to you maybe this is beautiful, to me a big house in the city is beautiful. So there's also that risk. So like maybe in our nostalgic longing back, post-urbanization, in our nostalgic longing back, we might project that longing onto people who actually don't have it. So there's also a risk there if there's a lack of internationalism or a lack of scalability.
Yeah, well, okay, so I would love to find a better word than localization, because it does carry with it all those misunderstandings, which for me, everything you're saying there is you're not actually understanding what we're saying. So number one, we're saying, rather than creating a global government where the people's voices will be so weak, we're saying let's start by breaking down the global corporations. So we're saying they need to belong to a place. They need to be localized. We are not committing any people to be localized. We're committing business. We're saying commercial transactions, any type of capitalism, wealth accumulation, that needs to be scaled down, so it is the overview and the control is from democracy. So this is a profound democratization, right? The first thing. And we're saying, first of all, in order to achieve that, we need to cooperate internationally. So we are totally committed to concern, solidarity across borders. But we don't understand that if we tell a guy in Indonesia or wherever you were, yeah, great to have a big house in the city, that we're selling him a false dream, because we're selling him a dream that is based on exploitation of other people and exploitation of nature, and it's not going to work very well. It's not going to be very sustainable. So then what you were saying about this, these other people who are dreaming of being in the city and having the big house there, what I found through personal encounters was that they loved my message, which was, in the West, there are lots of people who went into the city and they don't like it that much. They actually want to come back to smaller towns and to the land. And they're actually wanting to learn from you. People love that message, but they're getting 24/7 propaganda that they're inferior and primitive and backward and stupid, uneducated, know nothing. So if we didn't have that corporate empire blinding us and making us feel stupid and backward, then we really wouldn't have a problem, because people actually want to have more connection with each other, and we don't in the city. We walk past each other, we don't say hello. And that, again, in a smaller city, it can happen. And I think the ideal once we add up the numbers and we realize we don't want to contribute to a system where some people are robbing people of the right to clean drinking water or food, we really want an egalitarian system. We are going to come back with more localized, decentralized. I mean, another word is decentralized, which can work, but the thing about local is a lot of respect for local knowledge, for local traditions. And it's not about saying people are going to be localized. What does that mean? You know, locally in isolation is meaningless. You know, every farm is local. Every person is in some way local. Well, people aren't. You know, they're free to move. But remember, we're talking about businesses. And so in a small town, when people can start, which is happening, change the laws so that they can have their pension funds invest in businesses in their local area that they want to support. It's amazing what starts happening. And you get this relationship between the businesses and the clients or the consumers. And that doesn't mean that anyone is committed to just stay there. However, we would, in my movement, we would also wax lyrical about the importance of children having more continued relationships with more people. So ideally, when our children are growing up, we wouldn't keep moving every year. I remember a long time ago speculating that one of the reasons why there was so much more violence in America was that already in the 60s, the average American growing up moved 7 times. And in the meanwhile, I could see there was more community in Sweden and in Europe and less violence. So in terms of mental health, a sort of connection, ongoing connection is very beneficial, but it's not a prison. It doesn't mean that, you know, each and every person is now, you know, some kind of prisoner in a local economy. And the thing is, if we were to move around and experience other towns and regions where economies were more adapted to nature, culture, and community, it'd be so much richer. So that's another fact of life, is the diversity. But we can keep arguing about what language
No,
is.
it's not an argue, because I mean, nothing of what you said there contradicts anything of what I said.
Exactly.
I'm not talking about a world government.
Yeah.
If it's internationalist, it's based on, you know, international cooperation. And if it's localized, it is everything that you just said. So the big thing is still to bring down the corporate empire, right? But how to create that politically, how to create that level of solidarity between the countries, in which I believe eco-socialism is a good candidate. We have no eco-socialist party in Sweden. We've never seen it yet. These are pioneer thinkers. They have their institute in Barcelona today, and I think they're on, you know, because they're very aligned with everything that you're saying. And I think, like, if we can get that to focus more on localization and on internationalism, so that we can build up a movement that is for the people globally and locally, and for the respect of nature globally and locally, with respect to unique biospheres, etc. So that movement, like, where do I cast my ballot? This is also in an attempt to save or recover democracy, right? It's like, what would that political movement look like? Because I feel like a lot of what I'm hearing from you is, like, it sounds like such a great tool, like maybe the best tool to accomplish a lot of these things. That's why I really believe in this. That's why I've joined, you know, this campaign against ISDS and globalization and everything, because I do believe, and I completely share your perspective on it, and that as a you know, really important, crucial tool to establish a world which we all agree upon. We want to, you know, have a sustainable humanity and biodiversity and life, right? Life. Right?
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I think is that I'm totally open to changing the language, because it really brings with it all these assumptions and prejudices. But I was going to say that maybe, you know, we haven't talked that much about how we see things going beyond insisting that our government is no longer going to be representing the corporate empire instead of us. So they are going to only be voted in or allowed to stay if they're going to take on this task of getting an independence from the corporate empire and insisting that the businesses that are active in Sweden are also registered in Sweden. Now, that doesn't mean that there can't be trade. It doesn't mean that there couldn't be another company that's Spanish that's selling in Sweden. It's about, I so wish we could have visuals, to show the corporate empire running our governments and how then governments end up destroying, the lives, basically, of almost 8 billion people. Because the people who are benefiting, it's such a small number. And I want also
with no local loyalty whatsoever.
No.
We spoke about that yesterday with a woman who has written a book about the Swedish weapon system, or what do you call it? Weapon sales, right?
Yeah.
And most of the companies active in Sweden are global corporations.
Yeah.
So it's not even Swedish corporations.
No.
It's not. It's just like we're just producing it here and selling it from here, but it's not even our business.
Yeah.
And with an immense lobbyism, making our politicians loyal to them, which is, it's sucking everything out from us, right?
Absolutely.
And that's where socialism is potent, because they're saying, no, we don't accept the terms of your ownership, and we question that, and we want to bring the ownership back, and we want to bring the production back, and that's the potency of socialism, right? And again, it also questions the accumulated primitive accumulation over the centuries, right? Because we actually question the very legitimacy of that ownership, and I feel like if we miss that aspect of it, then the old players who have all the money, then they can just play the new game, still benefiting themselves. There also needs to be checks and balances against that old money and that old rule, right?
Yeah, but I think partly what I'm saying is that we have to insist that these businesses belong to a place or are localized.
Yes.
Doesn't mean they have to be owned by the government. Because privatizing downwards can often lead to greater efficiency and flexibility and responsiveness to the needs of people and the environment. So in some cases, I think probably, in terms of power and so on, maybe not even nationalized. Probably the ideal is going to be more regionalized. So again, decentralizing is going to have all kinds of benefits, because more eyes seeing and ensuring the lack of corruption and so on, is that all grows as you decentralize. So then, so you're talking about energy or trains, and so, communication, transportation, the industries are obviously going to be larger. But then when it comes to food production, you want to decentralize much more. So I think if we could just understand that we have not had a say at all in what type of agriculture we wanted to promote, what kind of housing we really want. We haven't had to say it. We've been told that we're doing the best to grow the economy for you, and we've been herded into a system that from A to Z depended on more fossil fuels, wasting energy, and it turns out it was polluting. So it's not just the chemicals which are killing more and more people. There's now massive increases in Parkinson's and all kinds of illnesses from pesticide. Then we have the plastic in our body, and the information that came out from scientists who in the early 90s became aware only through accident that plastic was so horribly negative for our health. Their report, Our Stolen Future, was completely suppressed. So we're not aware that because of the corporate system, we've not had the information about the choices we should have had. So I'm just saying that I think that once we realize that, we're also going to want to allow more people to participate in the judgment about what's acceptable and what isn't. So if I could give an example, I've been trying to get a local organic standard brought into some of the farmers' markets and local food economies I've helped to start. But until now, we haven't really been able to manage that. But I can tell you that I myself am far more trusting of the farmer who tells me in my town, no, I didn't use any chemicals, and him looking me in the eye and knowing that we could establish a local community group that runs the farmers market to actually go and check on those farms and to talk to the neighbors. And it'd be far more accurate than the standards that have been, been brought in, and they've been lowered more and more by the corporate influence. But even if we hadn't had Walmart and giant businesses coming up with their organic and a constant lowering of standards, even without that, I know that the more accurate assessment of whether something is being done well or not is going to be more local. We need more experiential knowledge. Does that make sense?
It does, but it's also, again, and we've talked about that before, because that makes sense to me in a rural area, but it makes less sense to me in a disadvantaged neighborhood, suburban, ghettofied, urbanized context, for instance.
Well,
right? So there's
why? Because
there needs to be an establishment of trust in governance, and I think that's the core issue here. That trust, that social contract, has been so eroded for such a long time. So we need to reestablish that level of trust in governance. Right,
yeah.
And if we have, because a lot of these things will need some level of centralization in terms of we need to build the railways, and we need to be able to trust organs to actually serve the people and planet, right? And if we can reestablish that level of trust, then we might be able to trust that whatever is sold in our supermarkets or groceries actually, stand to a certain level of test.
Yeah, but you see, I think the level of trust would be constantly subject to eyes and ears and people's experience who are going to be, supporting and reinforcing that. So we don't want a system where we say, okay, we're just handing over everything to you, and people have no right to determine what is the best way to do things. And that also, you see, when you're working more with nature and with people, you find that the diversity is so incredible that, the beauty about localization is it's not going to be the same everywhere. Not even the same, within Sweden, because people will have much more power to determine systems and have more power to put in place trustworthy structures. So yes, when it comes to trains, like I said, probably there should still be a regional voice and a committee that will have a say on where are these train lines going to run and where. And also, when you talked about the ghetto in the city, you see, so many of the local food initiatives have started from the city, where people have established from the city a relationship with farmers in the region. So why on earth shouldn't people in the ghetto or eating that food have a right to be part of determining whether it's grown properly? Right now we can't imagine that because we're not allowed to do the things that we would all like to do. We're not allowed to think about spending time making sure that the food we eat is grown healthy and is healthy, and that the way we care for our children is. We're enslaved in a system where we think more and more technology is in our benefit, using more and more energy. And could I just say about that, I think we should all be raising our voices against handing over AI to this empire. It comes out of the empire, the collaboration between intelligence, Silicon Valley, and the financial casino. And we should be doing everything we can to warn about what's going to happen with that massive mega technology, which apparently already last year, data centers used more drinking water than the whole global human population. So we're talking about massively increasing these data centers. For what? It's mainly for the war machine. Now, there are people who know the technology better than I do, who say it could be used in a positive way, but not in the hands of that empire. So, again, I think, we need to do everything we can to get, to break up the power of that empire without demonizing the people, but putting them back in place. They're one voice.
And also free them, right?
Yeah.
Because ultimately, I doubt their privilege, their emotional and spiritual privilege already today, because I don't think that seems like a nice place to live up there, and with constant fear of being, guillotined at one, knowing that's morally, which would be morally justified. I think that's a horrific state if I imagine it, right? Despite all the privileges, apparent privileges, right? So I think the liberation perspective, even of them, I feel like they sometimes are the most sick within the system, and I would want them to, I want to liberate them from their billions so they can live healthier lives, right?
And that's so related also to what I like to emphasize with everybody, which is that we don't realize that all of us have been pushed to run faster and faster and faster, running after technology, speeding up everything from growing the food to looking after our children to medical care, speeding it up so we don't have the care and the concern from other people and really being able to engage with one another the way we would all prefer it. So that means even the head of Exxon and Mobil both running like crazy so that one would be on top when they merge. So this path of mega mergers and going faster and faster and faster is killing us. And that's how we really also need to think about technology. We need to really say, as we reassess all this and we want people to have a voice, wouldn't we all prefer to slow down? And that means actually working few hours a day and week. And there's no reason why we shouldn't.
Right.
No, I have been quiet for a very long time. I have really enjoyed listening to you both. Fantastic conversation, because you have demonstrated what we have been talking about, having a conversation, respectful conversation, trying different thoughts, thinking together. So it's fantastic. But I would like to ask you, because you have worked for this tirelessly for decades. Are you optimistic? That's one question, because you have also told us about how this empire have grown and been more and more powerful over the same period. And also, where is the agency? What should we all do to be a force for good?
Yes, I mean, so first of all, in terms of doing, there is a terrible myth going around, which is we've had enough talking, let's just get on with the action. And I can tell you it's partly put out by corporate think tanks. We started this conversation by saying that there are so many conversations that we don't hear, and they're addressing the key and most important areas that affect our lives. We need more talking. And what does that mean? That is that my number one call to people is please share the bigger picture. Share what we shared today, but if you also look at our websites, ours is localfutures.org, you'll find a lot of material. We've worked with people on every continent and looking at the world from this very different point of view. The basic, our basic interest is human as well as ecological well-being. They're completely linked, but let's be aware that people are getting more and more impoverished. They're time-impoverished, they're running faster and faster, and so people are now being pitted against each other. So many people who are struggling to work think the environment is a luxury, and they think healthy food is elitist because they're not eco-literate, meaning economically literate as well as ecologically literate. So there's this huge need, and it can happen fairly quickly, to step back and look at this bigger picture and see that wonderfully there is a way forward where both people and nature can heal. But the big obstacle is we think we're in democracy, but we're not. We have to reclaim democracy so that we can be engaged in looking honestly at what this path will look like. And there, I'm very hopeful. I feel that at the grassroots, a lot of people are intuitively turning in the direction, in this sort of, I see a great cultural turning where people who have gone into the city and found it too speedy and too lonely are wanting to live with more community and have more walking distance relationships. And we have to be very careful now that we don't fall into the trap put out to us by the Monsantos and McDonald's of this world, which is that they're creating this 5 minutes walking city for us. And because their agenda, we will be 100% urbanized. There won't be any farmers, and there won't be any smaller villages, smaller towns, smaller cities. Once we really understand the trade-off and the beauty of being more connected to others and to nature, we will be supporting a path of decentralization. I know we will, and we already are. So the cultural turning is now that we identify lots of what we might call localization hubs around the world. And they are often, smaller towns where people who could afford to move because they wanted to have more community, they wanted to have a slightly slower pace, and they wanted more contact with nature. They wanted their children to be able to run around free and not concerned about all the traffic, and more connection with animals. So it is at this moment, these local hubs tend to be settled by, fairly privileged people. But not only, they were often colonized before that by quite poor hippies. And you see them all over the world. You see Freiburg in Germany, you see Järna outside Stockholm, you see, the whole sort of California area around Berkeley, you see Boulder, and in England, Totnes, and there are many, many more. Many, many more. And what you find is that in those new local areas, the status of women is much higher than in the general situation, and the status of the feminine, of men carrying babies on their bodies is so important and that is a real symbol of this great cultural turning towards more feminine, caring, nurturing, cooperative, peaceful ways of doing things. More collaborative ways of doing things. And again, also the emphasis on NVC, nonviolent communication, really learning how to speak to one another in a kind of more caring way. So there's a whole fabric of ways that people are coming back to something healthier and more peaceful. And I'm quite convinced that will continue to grow. But the reason I'm working very hard at 80, and I've been doing it for 50 years, is because I also see that because many people who intuitively turn towards the more caring way are not aware of this empire. And we can't afford to ignore it because we're now getting to the point where do we hand over AI to that and do we...
They already have it.
Well,
They are producing it. They are having it. It's already... That's the problem.
Yeah.
They are driving innovation. That's why innovation under globalist capitalism will never work.
Yeah.
But,
it will never work.
You're saying...
But I think what we can expect is that the movement, which is actually really strong in America now, very interesting that, as you were saying, Frida, there is so much more positive at the grassroots in America than you would expect, which is really heartening because, at the level of government and so on, it's mad. So I think, there's much, much more happening that's positive, and it's the people power from the bottom up, community-based. It's when people change the I to a we. And instead of just thinking, what can I do? It's what can we do together? And why I also love AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, as one of the methods that is demonstrating the power of changing the I to a we and connecting to the truth that we're part of a much larger fabric of life, that we are one tiny little, grain of sand. But I think the wonderful thing about when we connect to that truth spiritually, we feel so much more empowered because we're part of something so much larger. And having the faith in that and feeling part of that is so healing. And that's what's happening also in the localization movement as people come together in human scale groups.
But that leads me to another question, and that has to be the last question, I think, because we need to wrap up. But because here in the Western world we are told constantly that we are superior to all others, and also that we should be afraid. There is a massive propaganda from the military-industrial complex to find everyone else as a threat to us. And you have seen so much of the world and know people from all over. Can you say something against that perception of the world that we?
Yeah, I would love to. Again, we'd love for us to talk about it longer, because I was also invited by U.S. intelligence to go and give a seminar on what is localization, and then they later sent me their report where they're saying, you know, we have got to fuse humans and technology together for our flagship because of this fear. And it's the fear of the China that they created, the modern Russia that they created. So my big plea to everyone is, please help to wake the world up to the fact that this is coming from the West, and that we have for sure the power to reach out a hand for a détente, for the idea that we're going to calm down and not rush into this war over minerals on Mars and Moon and in the deep seabed. Let's just take a deep breath. And, you know, America and the West, with all of those military bases around the world, they have the upper hand. And I have been in Russia, and I have been in China, and I have spoken to powerful people in both, particularly in China. And I'm quite convinced that they would be very relieved and happy to sign on to a détente in terms of this escalation. So...
Well, that's my key mission in what I do. And you have given me so many more reasons to continue that work. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you. It's so wonderful to meet you and to collaborate together. I hope we can continue the conversation and keep collaborating. So. Thank you both so much.
Thank you. Yeah. See you soon in the next time.
Yeah. Thank you.